At Westbridge University, a heated confrontation breaks out when a professor makes a shocking racist statement in class. But a black student refuses to be silenced. He stands up for justice. But what can a kid do? What happens next will shock you. The truth is slowly revealed. Follow the fierce battle unfolding on H2 Black Thread. If you fight for justice, subscribe and join the fight. The lecture hall at Westbridge University was one of the largest on campus, an old but prestigious structure with towering arched ceilings and heavy wooden doors that groaned whenever someone entered late. Rows of students filled the seats, some hunched over notebooks, others half listening while scrolling through their phones. The room had the sterile feel of academia, where ideas were debated, challenged, and sometimes, if you weren't careful, weaponized. Among the crowd sat Dante Sullivan, a sharp-minded, observant black student who had always found himself at odds with the way history was taught. He was positioned toward the middle of the lecture hall, where he had a clear view of Professor Richard Caldwell, a man notorious for his polarizing views. Dante had signed up for this class fully aware of Caldwell's reputation. The professor had a long history of making provocative statements, often bordering on offensive, all under the guise of intellectual discourse. Some students admired him for it, claiming he challenged traditional thinking, while others loathed his thinly veiled attempts at legitimizing outdated ideologies. Dante had sat through weeks of these lectures, listening carefully, taking notes, not on what Caldwell was teaching, but on the patterns of his manipulation. Caldwell had a way of presenting skewed perspectives as absolute truths, cherry-picking historical data to suit a biased agenda. And today, Dante sensed something coming. Caldwell stood at the front of the class, writing in large, bold letters on the whiteboard cultural contributions to civilization. His back was straight, his suit immaculate, and his air of authority absolute. Caldwell had mastered the art of performance. Every movement, every calculated pause was designed to command attention. He turned to the students, glancing across the room as if waiting to deliver something groundbreaking. Then, with a slight smile, he said the words that would change the atmosphere in an instant. Some cultures have simply failed to contribute significantly to civilization. The statement landed like a grenade. For a brief moment, there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the weight of what had been said hanging thick in the air. Then, slowly, a ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some students shifted in their seats, others glanced around nervously as if hoping someone else would react first. A few lowered their heads, staring intently at their notes as if willing themselves to disappear. To Dante, this wasn't surprising. He had seen it before. This was how silence worked. It was a survival tactic, a learned behavior in institutions like this, where the power dynamics were always skewed in favor of men like Caldwell. Beside him, Elena Vasquez, a Latina student with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, stiffened. Her grip on her pen tightened, and for a second, Dante thought she might say something. But she didn't. She exhaled softly, glanced at him, and shook her head slightly. Across the room, a white student in the front row, Olivia Carter, looked visibly uncomfortable. She cleared her throat as if about to speak, but then hesitated. No one wanted to be the first, and that was the problem. Dante could feel the anger rising in his chest, not just at Caldwell, but at the silence. The way this kind of rhetoric was allowed to thrive because no one ever called it what it was. His pulse thumped against his skin. He had two choices. He could do what so many had done before: let it pass, let the moment dissolve into yet another unchallenged insult buried under the weight of academic pretension. Or he could stand up, alone if necessary. The decision wasn't hard. With deliberate movement, Dante pushed back his chair. The screech of metal against tile was deafening in the stillness of the room. Every head snapped toward him. Eyes widened. Some students exchanged thrilled but nervous glances, suddenly aware that something was about to happen. A few hurriedly reached for their phones, discreetly pressing record. Dante rose to his full height, his stance unshaken, his voice controlled but laced with steel. "Professor Caldwell, do you ever get tired of twisting history?" A collective gasp rippled through the class. Caldwell paused mid-stride. He turned toward Dante, one brow raised, an almost amused smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Ah, Mr. Sullivan," he said smoothly. "I was wondering when you'd finally speak up." His tone was mocking, dismissive, as if Dante's presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, an amusing distraction. "By all means," Caldwell gestured grandly, "educate me." Dante's jaw tightened, but he didn't react emotionally. That's exactly what Caldwell wanted. He wanted Dante to lash out, to get angry, to become the stereotype Caldwell had already constructed in his mind. Dante wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You're standing here in front of a room full of students, telling us that some cultures haven't contributed to civilization. You're saying that as if history wasn't deliberately erased, rewritten, and distorted by those in power." A murmur spread through the class. Caldwell tilted his head, his smirk unwavering. "History is documented fact, Mr. Sullivan. If certain groups had contributed significantly, it would be reflected in the records." Dante let out a slow, humorless laugh. "Whose records?" "Yours. The ones that conveniently exclude entire civilizations. The ones that erase black scholars, scientists, and leaders who revolutionized industries, despite every obstacle thrown at them." A few students nodded subtly. Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. "You're being emotional." Dante stiffened. There it was, the classic gaslighting tactic. "Emotional," Dante repeated, "or just unwilling to let another professor rewrite history for his own agenda." The room felt electric. Some students looked down, unsure of where to stand. Others held their phones higher, knowing this moment would be important. Caldwell's smirk faltered for just a second. For the first time Dante saw it, a flicker of uncertainty. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, and Dante wasn't done yet. "You want to talk about civilization?" Dante's voice cut through the air. "Let's talk about who built it." The entire room held its breath. For the first time, Caldwell looked less certain. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a reckoning. For a moment, the only sound in the classroom was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Dante stood firm, his gaze locked onto Professor Richard Caldwell, who regarded him with the same smug amusement he always carried. But something was different now. The power dynamic in the room was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Caldwell let out a breath, shaking his head slightly as if Dante's response was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a speed bump on his path to enlightening the students with his so-called objective historical analysis. He leaned against the podium, crossing his arms over his chest, the smirk never leaving his face. "Ah, Mr. Sullivan, always so eager to challenge, yet so unwilling to engage with the facts. You see, this is exactly what I mean." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the class as if they were an audience in a debate hall. The emotional response, the immediate outrage. Instead of engaging with the data, with the undeniable historical record, you default to indignation. The words were carefully chosen, crafted to put Dante on the defensive, to make him seem irrational. It was a well-practiced tactic, but Dante knew better. He took a step forward, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Emotional. That's convenient, Professor. That's what people like you always say when you don't want to deal with uncomfortable truths. A few students shifted in their seats. Some of them looked at Dante with a mix of admiration and trepidation. Others avoided his gaze entirely, unsure of where they stood. "Let's talk about your facts, Professor," Dante continued, his voice unwavering. "The ones you like to cherry-pick to fit your narrative." He pointed to the whiteboard. "You stand up here and act like history is some neutral, objective account of what happened. But history isn't just what's written down, it's who gets to write it." A murmur spread through the room. Caldwell's expression flickered, but he quickly recovered, pushing off from the podium with a theatrical sigh. "Ah, yes, the history is written by the victor's argument. Convenient, but tired. We live in an era of information, Mr. Sullivan. If something is true, it will be documented." Dante let out a short, humorless laugh. "Really? So if something isn't documented by those in power, it didn't happen?" Caldwell didn't answer, so Dante pressed forward. "Tell me, Professor, when was the first open-heart surgery performed?" Caldwell narrowed his eyes slightly at the unexpected question. "1893 by Dr. Daniel Hale Williams," he answered, his tone clipped. Dante nodded. "And do most textbooks mention that Dr. Williams was black? That he founded one of the first black-owned hospitals in the country because black patients weren't allowed in white hospitals? Or do they just credit later white surgeons for medical advancements he pioneered?" Silence. Dante's voice rose slightly, gaining momentum. "Or let's talk about technology. You love innovation, right? Who do we credit for the development of filament in light bulbs? Thomas Edison." Caldwell exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly irritated now. "Lewis Latimer." "Exactly," Dante said. "A black man, but most people don't know his name because history doesn't remember black excellence unless we force it to." A murmur of agreement spread through the class. More students were paying attention now, sitting up straighter, phones still discreetly recording. Caldwell's fingers tightened against the podium, but his expression remained a mask of cold amusement. "Mr. Sullivan, you seem to be under the impression that oppression is an excuse for lack of achievement. Yet here you stand in one of the finest universities in the country, proving that meritocracy works." Dante exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Meritocracy." He stepped closer, voice low but powerful. "Tell that to the black students who have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The ones who are followed in stores. The ones who are pulled over for no reason. The ones who don't get second chances when they make mistakes." Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. "You're making this personal, Sullivan." "It is personal," Dante snapped, "because people like you make it personal when you stand up here and act like we haven't spent generations fighting to be seen." Caldwell's smirk finally faltered, and then, to everyone's surprise, Elena Vasquez stood up. "He's right." The class turned toward her. She crossed her arms, her expression hard. "History is written by the victors, and the victors erase what doesn't serve them. You act like history is just about data, but it's about who was allowed to participate in the first place." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Miss Vasquez, if you find this class so disagreeable, you are welcome to leave." Dante opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the door at the back of the lecture hall creaked open. A woman stepped inside, arms crossed. Professor Miranda Chase, head of the ethics department. Her gaze swept the room, lingering on Caldwell before settling on Dante and Elena. Then, with an air of quiet authority, she stepped forward. "I was walking by when I heard an interesting discussion. Thought I'd sit in for a minute." Caldwell visibly tensed. "Professor Chase, this is a closed lecture." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Is it? Because it sounds more like a public trial." She turned her attention to the students, her voice calm but firm. "How many of you recorded this discussion?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. "Good," Professor Chase said, turning back to Caldwell, "because I think the university would love to hear exactly what's being taught in its classrooms." Caldwell's face paled slightly. For the first time, he looked unsure. The power in the room had shifted, and Dante knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air outside felt sharper than usual as Dante stepped out of the lecture hall. He could still hear the murmurs of his classmates behind him, their voices blending together in a mix of shock, admiration, and uncertainty. Some had nodded at him in quiet approval as they packed up their things, while others refused to make eye contact, slipping out of the room as if eager to pretend that nothing had happened. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had known what speaking up would mean. He had known the risk. But still, nothing could have fully prepared him for the way the room had cracked open the moment he stood up. He could feel the shift in power, the ripple of an impending storm. And yet, Dante wasn't afraid. Elena caught up with him as they made their way down the hallway of the humanities building, her pace brisk, her expression unreadable. "That was insane," she finally said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You really went for it." Dante let out a breath, shaking his head. "I wasn't going to just sit there and let him rewrite history." Elena shot him a look, lowering her voice. "Yeah, but you know how this school works, Dante. You embarrassed him, and Caldwell isn't the kind of man to take that lightly." Dante didn't respond right away. He knew she was right. Westbridge University had a long history of protecting its own. It was an institution built on prestige and power never liked to be challenged. But Dante wasn't about to let this get buried. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the Twitter app. He had already seen students whispering, heads bent over their screens. The video was out there already, he could feel it. And if it wasn't, it needed to be. His thumbs moved quickly as he typed. "Professor Richard Caldwell openly disrespected black students in class today. This isn't education. This is racist propaganda. We won't stay silent." He hesitated for only a second before adding, "Expose Caldwell," a simple phrase but a powerful one. He hit post. At first, nothing happened. Just the standard 3 dots of loading, the screen refreshing. Then a ping, and another, and another. Within minutes, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Retweets, likes, comments flooding in from students, alumni, even strangers who had never stepped foot in Westbridge University but knew this story all too well. At Jasmine, not surprised, took his class 2 years ago, dude tried to argue that black people have culturally ingrained disadvantages. Straight up eugenics BS. At Bree Wilson 97, Caldwell's been doing this for years. He dismissed me when I questioned his views on slavery in class. Told me I was reading too much into it. At Real Marcus J., this happens all the time at these institutions. They want black students for diversity brochures but won't protect them. Expose Caldwell, the numbers were climbing fast. By noon, Expose Caldwell was trending in New York City. By evening, it had reached national attention. Dante sat in the campus cafe, fingers drumming against the table, his phone vibrating with relentless notifications. Every few seconds, another tweet, another share, another DM from a student he had never met but who had a story to tell. Then came the articles. First, from the Westbridge Gazette, the university's independent student paper. Westbridge professor under fire for racially charged remarks in lecture. Then, from a local news station. Students at Westbridge University speak out against racism in the classroom. By nightfall, larger outlets started picking it up. The power of student activism. Westbridge University faces backlash over professors' comments. The messages in his inbox were overwhelming. Some were from fellow students offering support. others from former students sharing their own experiences with Caldwell. But some were hateful. "Stop making everything about race. Caldwell was just teaching facts. Maybe you're the problem. Typical victim mentality. No wonder you people can't succeed." Dante clenched his jaw. He knew this was coming. He had expected it. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. A call buzzed through his phone. "Elena." "Dante, have you seen the front of the administration building?" "No, why?" "Get over here now." When Dante arrived, he was stunned. What had started as a small gathering of students holding signs had exploded into a full-scale protest. A crowd had formed outside Westbridge's administration building. Students from all backgrounds, black, white, Latino, Asian, stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices fierce and unwavering. "No hate in our classrooms. No more lies. No more bias. Expose Caldwell, hold him accountable." The signs were powerful. History belongs to all of us. Education shouldn't be racist. Black students matter. Elena stood near the front, next to Olivia Carter, the white student from class who had stayed silent during the confrontation. But she was here now. She held a sign that read, "Silence equals complicity." Dante pushed through the crowd, his heartbeat thrumming in his ears. And then he saw him. Caldwell, standing on the steps of the administration building, arms crossed, surrounded by other faculty members. For the first time, he didn't look smug. He looked worried. Dante met his gaze across the crowd, and for a brief second he saw it, uncertainty. But Dante wasn't naive. This wasn't over. Not yet. An hour into the protest, a university spokesperson stepped onto the steps, raising their hands for silence. "We hear your concerns," the crowd booed. "We take all student complaints seriously. The university will be conducting a full internal review." "We don't need a review," someone shouted. "We need action." Dante stepped forward. "A review means nothing if the outcome is already decided." The administrator stiffened. "We encourage a respectful dialogue as we work toward a resolution." More boos erupted. "This isn't about dialogue," Dante said. "This is about accountability." The administrator hesitated before finally reading from a prepared statement. "The university has scheduled an emergency hearing to formally address the concerns surrounding Professor Richard Caldwell. The hearing will take place tomorrow evening." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Elena turned to Dante. "They're feeling the pressure." Dante nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good, let's make sure they don't forget it." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Dante knew tomorrow would be the real test. And he would be ready. The air inside the university auditorium was heavy with anticipation. Every seat was filled, and a tense murmur rippled through the room as students, faculty, and administrators took their places. The walls of the hall, adorned with grand portraits of past university presidents, seemed to loom over the gathering, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up for the university's disciplinary panel, made up of senior administrators and faculty members. In the center sat Professor Richard Caldwell, his expression carefully neutral, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. He was flanked by two legal advisors, evidence that he fully intended to fight back. Across from him, in the section designated for speakers, Dante Sullivan sat with his shoulders squared, his expression calm but resolute. To his left was Elena Vasquez, flipping through pages of notes, and to his right, Professor Miranda Chase, arms crossed, her sharp gaze locked onto the proceedings. The president of the university, Dr. Howard Kensington, cleared his throat into the microphone, calling the room to order. The murmurs died down, and the weight of the moment settled over them all. "We are here today to address formal concerns regarding Professor Richard Caldwell's conduct in the classroom. As an institution, Westbridge University is committed to fostering an environment of intellectual rigor and respectful discourse. Today, we will hear statements from students and faculty before making a determination on appropriate next steps. Dr. Kensington's voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to damage control. Caldwell sat up straighter, adjusting the lapels of his suit before speaking. "Thank you, Dr. Kensington." His voice was steady, carrying the same confidence he had wielded in his lectures. "I would like to begin by stating, unequivocally, that my role as an educator is to challenge students, to encourage them to engage critically with historical narratives. If certain individuals find discomfort in that process, I cannot control how they interpret facts." His words were carefully chosen, laced with the implication that those who had taken offense were simply too fragile to handle academic discussion. Dante exhaled slowly, clenching his jaw. He knew this tactic. Caldwell wasn't going to defend himself. He was going to play the victim. "Furthermore," Caldwell continued, gesturing toward the audience, "I believe we must ask ourselves an important question. Are we fostering a university where free speech and academic exploration are valued? Or are we allowing a vocal minority to dictate what can and cannot be discussed in the classroom?" A few scattered nods came from certain faculty members, the old guard, the ones who had supported Caldwell for years. Then, Dr. Kensington turned to Dante. "Mr. Sullivan, you have the floor." Dante stood, his palms pressing against the table for a brief moment before he spoke. "With all due respect, Professor Caldwell, challenging students isn't the issue. Twisting facts and erasing black contributions isn't critical thinking, it's indoctrination." A murmur swept through the audience. Caldwell let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Indoctrination, Mr. Sullivan, is that really what you believe?" Dante didn't miss a beat. "Yes, because you don't challenge students to think, you challenge them to accept your version of history. You stand in front of that classroom and push a narrative that deliberately ignores the truth, that erases the contributions of marginalized communities while pretending objectivity." Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but Dante wasn't done. "You call it a meritocracy. But tell me, Professor, if the playing field has always been equal, why is it that we still have to fight for our history to be acknowledged? Why is it that, every time a black scholar is mentioned, it's treated as a footnote instead of part of the main text?" Alina stood next, her voice sharp as steel. "This isn't about free speech. It's about power. It's about the fact that, for years, Professor Caldwell has used his position to push a one-sided narrative, to dismiss and belittle students who challenge him. And we have proof." She turned to the large screen that had been set up beside the panel. A student from the tech team tapped on their laptop and a video flickered to life. Caldwell's own words filled the room. "If you look at test scores and historical trends, it's clear that certain groups have simply lagged behind. That's not bias, that's data. Slavery was a tragic but necessary economic system at the time, and many historians argue that it ultimately contributed to the development of the Western economy. Not everyone can be an innovator. Some cultures have produced far more intellectual progress than others. It's just historical reality." Each clip was damning, each statement a blow to the defense Caldwell had so carefully crafted. The room was dead silent. For the first time, Caldwell's confident mask cracked. His legal advisors whispered furiously to him, but the damage was done. Then, Professor Chase stood. She didn't need notes. She didn't need video evidence. She had lived through this. "For years, people like you have made black students feel unwelcome in spaces that should have belonged to them just as much as anyone else. You've used tenure as a shield to protect yourself from consequences, and you've dismissed any challenge to your authority as emotional or misguided. But that ends now." Dr. Kensington adjusted his glasses, clearly uneasy. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat before finally speaking. Given the gravity of the concerns raised and the overwhelming evidence provided, the university has made a decision. Effective immediately, Professor Richard Caldwell will be placed on indefinite suspension pending further investigation. For a moment, silence. Then, applause erupted. It started with a few students, then grew louder, filling the entire hall. Some faculty members clapped hesitantly, while others remained still, their expressions grim. Dante exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had been gripping his chest begin to ease. But even as the victory settled over the room, he knew this wasn't over. Because the truth was, Caldwell wasn't the only one. There were others, other professors, other institutions, other systems that had worked for centuries to bury the voices of people like him. And now, it was time to make sure they never got the chance again. The applause still echoed in Dante's ears as the crowd began to disperse from the university auditorium. The announcement of Professor Caldwell's suspension had sent a ripple through Westbridge University, a historic institution that had prided itself on academic excellence, but had long ignored the biases embedded in its foundation. Dante stood near the front, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was a victory. There was no doubt about that. But as he looked around the room, he realized something. Suspending Caldwell didn't fix the problem. It just put a temporary bandage on it. He could still see other professors watching from the shadows, their faces tight with disapproval. Some students whispered among themselves, still unwilling to take a side. The system that had protected Caldwell for years was still very much intact. Alina nudged him with her elbow, a small grin on her face. "You did it." Dante exhaled, shaking his head. "We did it," he corrected. Alina nodded, but her smile faded slightly. "You know this isn't over, right?" Dante glanced toward the back of the room where Dr. Howard Kensington, the university president, stood in quiet conversation with several board members. Even now, Dante could see the gears turning in their minds, how to contain the damage, how to ensure this storm passed without actually making any fundamental changes. And that's when it hit him. This fight was never about just one professor. Caldwell had been a symptom, but the disease was much bigger than him. That night, Dante sat on the floor of his dorm room, scrolling through Twitter. Expose Caldwell was still trending, but something even bigger had begun to take shape. Students from other universities were sharing their own stories. At Asia U Chicago, had a prof who told me affirmative action is the only reason I got into college. When I complained, they told me to toughen up. This isn't just about Westbridge. It's everywhere. Expose Caldwell exposed the system at Devon MNIU. I was failed in a course because my professor didn't like that I challenged his slavery wasn't that bad argument. Admin did nothing. These people are untouchable. Time to change that. Expose the system at Maya Wash U. This is bigger than one school. If we don't keep pushing, they'll just replace Caldwell with someone who thinks the same way. Dismantle the system. Dante felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just about Westbridge anymore. This was about something bigger. His phone vibrated with a notification, a group chat invitation from Alina. "Join us," the message read. Dante tapped the notification, and suddenly he was in a chat with over a dozen students from across different universities. The title of the group, Students for Accountability. Alina's message popped up first. "This isn't just about Caldwell. We need to go after the whole system. We need to make this impossible to ignore." Another student, Miles from UCLA, responded, "What if we create a national campaign? A platform where students can submit evidence of bias from their schools. Make it public, make it loud." A flood of enthusiastic responses followed. And just like that, a movement was born. By morning, the university's administration had released a formal statement. Westbridge University remains committed to fostering an environment of academic rigor and diversity. We acknowledge the concerns raised by our students and are taking proactive steps to ensure all voices are heard. A faculty review board will be formed to evaluate future complaints in an effort to maintain fairness in academic discourse. Dante stared at the statement on his screen. Then he let out a bitter laugh. A faculty review board. That's their solution. Alina leaned over his shoulder, reading along. They're just trying to control the narrative. They want people to think they're doing something without actually changing anything. Dante tossed his phone onto his desk, frustration bubbling up. They don't want real change. They just want the story to go away. Alina was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Then we don't let it. She grabbed a marker from his desk and scribbled something on his whiteboard. Student action meeting 7 p.m. Dante raised an eyebrow. What is this? Our next step, she said simply. That evening, more students showed up than they had expected. The meeting was held in the student lounge and every chair was filled. Some students leaned against the walls. Others sat cross-legged on the floor. At the front of the room, Dante took a deep breath before speaking. I know a lot of you are here because you saw what happened with Caldwell, but this isn't just about him. It's about the fact that for too long, this university, and universities across the country, have allowed professors like him to operate without consequence. It's about the fact that when we speak up, we're told we're being too sensitive or too emotional. It's about the fact that we have to fight twice as hard just to be treated like we belong. A few students nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading through the crowd. This doesn't end with a suspension, Dante continued. Because they'll replace Caldwell with someone just like him if we let them. That's why we're forming the Student Coalition for Accountability. This isn't just about Westbridge anymore. We're going to expose every professor, every administrator, and every policy that upholds systemic bias. And we're not stopping until we see real change. Applause erupted. A student from the back, a sophomore named Jamal, raised his hand. So what do we do first? Dante exchanged a glance with Alina, then turned back to the crowd. We make it impossible for them to ignore us. Over the next few weeks, Expose the System spread like wildfire. A website was launched where students could submit testimonials and evidence of bias at their own schools. Petitions began circulating, demanding mandatory racial bias training for faculty. Protests spread beyond Westbridge, reaching other universities across the country. The administration at Westbridge, overwhelmed by the backlash, was forced to hold public town halls where students confronted them directly. One by one, other professors with histories of racist rhetoric were exposed. Westbridge tried to contain the movement. They failed, because this wasn't about just one professor anymore. It was about the system that allowed him to exist unchecked. And as Dante stood at the front of yet another protest, megaphone in hand, the roar of students behind him, he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. We're not just fighting to take down one man. We're fighting to dismantle an entire system that allowed him to thrive. Dante Sullivan wasn't done, not by a long shot.